Reason number 46 to get a Nissan. Features, especially the ones you get with the 2025 Nissan Kicks Play. Integrated Apple CarPlay, a spacious interior, advanced safety features, and more room in your budget. Because it's the most affordable new vehicle in Quebec. Get the 2025 Nissan Kicks Play S from only $22,774, including a $2,600 cash purchase bonus. Visit your Nissan dealer today. Until March 2nd, conditions apply. Details at Nissan.
Robin Flynn filling in for Elias Makos with you until 12 p.m. Elias will be back on Monday, by the way, after some deserved time off for the holidays, but it's been a lot of fun hanging out with you. It was the third best year for CEOs' salaries since 2007. This is according to data compiled by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. In 2023, the 100 top paid Canadian CEOs earned on average $13.2 million. By January 2nd at 10:54 a.m. on the nose, the average CEO on the list had already made over $62,000, which is the average annual income for a Canadian worker in just 2 days. Canadians are rightfully upset, but what can we actually do about it? David MacDonald is a senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and he joins me now. Good morning, David.
Good morning.
It seems like CEO salaries just keep going up, and worker salaries just don't seem to be increasing at quite the same rate. Is that fair to say?
That's certainly generally true. In the 1980s, we had CEOs. CEOs made more than the average worker in the 1980s. In the 1980s, they only made 50 times more than the average worker. In the 1990s, it was up to 100 times, and now we're pretty consistently over 200 times what the average worker makes. This last year's worth of data, we saw a slight improvement. I don't think it changes the general trend, but we did see fairly big raises for workers in the last year of almost 7% year over year. And this is in part because workers were clawing their way back from the hole that inflation dug for them, trying to get back to the same level of goods and services they could buy prior to this big run-up in inflation. On the other hand, inflation has come down to about 2%, and a real tear is being shed in boardrooms across the country that it's over. During this period, 2021, 2022, incredible times for corporate Canada. They had never before had this ability to raise prices rapidly and therefore increase profits rapidly. And so as a result, CEO pay is made up almost entirely of bonuses. Those bonuses are going to be related to company performance of some description. And so if the profit margins are at record highs, then bonuses are at record highs as a result. Profit margins are not quite at record highs in this latest data point, a little bit lower than the previous 2 years. And so same for CEO pay, it's down a little bit, but still the gap is well over 200 times.
Jeez. It's just, there seems to be so much disdain right now. It feels like, the middle class feels like it's kind of eroding a little bit, that you're either in that upper echelon or you're in like a lower middle class. The true middle class doesn't really seem to exist anymore. There's a lot of frustration when I'm talking to like a lot of my friends and stuff. They're just so angry at CEOs. You have, stories, what happened in the US with Luigi Mangione. I mean, obviously that was healthcare related, insurance related, a little bit different, but I've seen online stories of big companies removing headshots of their CEOs from their websites because they don't want people to know who they are because people are so angry right now. Are you seeing that same sort of sentiment, that people are just angry at these high-paid CEOs?
Yeah, certainly. And, you take times of economic crises like the last couple of years where inflation was really high. A lot of Canadians were pretty hurt by that. They can't buy groceries, right? They can't buy the basics, can't buy gas because everything's so expensive. And at the other end of that, folks in the boardrooms are seeing paydays like they've never seen before. They tell it, the story from corporate Canada is, we're just covering our costs. There's nothing we can do about it. Except you look at the books and it turns out it's record high profits like we've never seen before in Canada in terms of the profit margins. And then the CEOs get record paydays. And so you get the grocery store chains, for instance, right? Oh, no, we're just passing on costs, except margins are up. CEO bonuses are up. And so this is the disconnect that folks see, is that, here's folks making, tens of millions of dollars every year after year, good times and bad. I mean, the idea, of course, behind bonuses and behind CEOs getting paid almost entirely in bonuses is that they could, like there's actual money on the line that if the company does badly, the CEO does badly. And if the company does well, the CEO does well. That's the basic idea. Certainly when the company does well, the CEO does well. That is absolutely true. But we can go back to 2020, a year when profits were not high. Profits were down. It was a bad year for corporate Canada, but bonuses didn't go down. And this is the flip side, is that even if the company does badly, half of the CEOs on our list that year, either they just changed how the bonus formulas work to make sure they got the bonus anyway, or they called up the feds and said, hey, we need a rescue. We need a bailout. Can you come give us some of that wage subsidy money? And the Fed said, sure thing. And then they paid the bonuses out anyway. And so you end up with this system where when times are great, you pay the bonuses. When times are bad, you pay the bonuses. Run that system for 10 or 20 years, and all of a sudden you've got a huge gap between what CEOs get paid and what workers get paid.
No kidding. And it seems like, a company did well, so the CEO gets their bonus, but the workers were also responsible for the reason that the company did well that year. So whatever happened to, when times are good, we reward our employees, like year-end bonuses, Christmas bonuses, those used to be the standard. I mean, if you watch National Lampoon's Vacation, you see Chevy Chase is already putting down a down payment on a pool, right? Because he was so sure he was going to get this huge bonus. That was the norm 20, 30 years ago. But now nobody I know gets a bonus. And if they do, it's a joke. It's a couple $100 or an Amazon gift card. Why is all of that bonus money going right up to the top instead of trickling down to the people who are actually, on the ground contributing on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so on average, CEOs made $13 million. 11 million of that 13 was bonuses. And so you get some idea of how dependent they are on bonuses. Their salary, I mean, they make a salary. It was only worth about $1 million only, I guess, all relative. And so they're heavily dependent on these bonuses. This, I think, is what really grates on folks, is that when the company does well, when the economy does well, who benefits from that? In times of crisis, who gets hurt by times of crisis? Certainly the average worker in the inflationary period. But across Canada and boardrooms, for shareholders, this was a great time, really a stellar time for them, incredible returns because of their ability to increase prices. And so folks disconnect, right? They say, look, why am I working so hard when I don't see a benefit, right? I'm not seeing good luck getting a wage increase that even matches the rate of inflation these days, much less exceeds it. So you actually get ahead instead of just kind of barely hanging on by your fingernails, which is what a lot of workers have been doing for the last couple of years.
In conversation with David MacDonald, senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Now, are policy makers perhaps examining ways out of this corporate greed? Like, I've seen people joke online about capping CEO salaries so they don't make more than, let's say, 10 times what the lowest paid employee makes. That gives incentive to pay your workers a little bit better so that you can collect a little bit more money. Is something like that ever even possible? Or, would that be discouraged? I don't know. Is that even an option?
Some companies in certain countries, like the UK, are actually required to publish those types of statistics at the company level. So, you compare the executive pay to the average worker pay, and you get a ratio kind of like what we're calculating in this report. The one downside of that approach is that it tells you a lot more about the industry than it does about the individual CEO and how much they get paid. So if you take two CEOs, say they both get paid $13 million, one of which runs a grocery store chain and one of which runs a software company. Well, the average worker in a software company just is going to make more. That's just the nature of the business. Whereas the average worker in the grocery store chain is going to make, at or near minimum wage. So the ratio is going to be a lot bigger for the grocery store chain than it's going to be for the software chain. Does that mean that, the $13 million is better or worse than the grocery store chain? I mean, it's not clear to me that that's true. You could think as well of a garment company where they subcontract out all their garment making to Vietnam. And those workers, they're not getting paid minimum wage by Canadian standards. They're getting paid minimum wage by Vietnam standards, which is, dollars a day, not dollars an hour. And so because it's subcontracted, maybe the ratio looks really good for that worker who's subcontracted out all their work to some developing country. So I'm not sure that the ratio cap is the best approach, just because it really has a lot more to do with what industry you're in rather than how much you pay your CEO, which is why when we do this analysis, we just compare the CEOs broadly to the workers broadly, and so you don't have that same kind of problem.
The Montreal Economic Institute came out and criticized this report. They said that it, quote, presented a flawed perspective through selective use of data. But I mean, their salaries are their salaries. I don't know how that's selective use of data. But they said that it doesn't paint a proper picture of worker management relations. But I mean, if my boss is making 200 times what I make, we're probably not getting along so good. But what's your response to what the MEI had to say?
Yeah, I mean, I bet it's not conducive to worker management relations. And I'm sure when you go, if you're in a union and you go into bargaining and you say, look, my boss makes 200 times what I make. Maybe I can get an extra $1 an hour. I think that's probably something that workers would latch on to. We've actually seen a fair amount of strikes in the last year, and this is definitely part of the argument is, look, these execs are getting paid all the way to the bank, right? Inflation's great for them. Why can't I get a raise? And I think those are real arguments that should be being used. When companies make profits, how much of those profits are being reinvested in workers and workers' wages and their training and their equipment so they can become more productive versus those profits being paid out to shareholders through dividends, through share buybacks, through executive compensation. Right? These are real arguments as to, we've seen these big corporate tax cuts in the early 2000s. What are companies doing with that money, right? They're not necessarily investing it in workers. What we've seen is a lot of that money ended up as payouts to rich shareholders. That's not what they promised they're going to do with the money, but that's what happened. And so I think these are absolutely valid approaches when people go in to talk to their bosses. Say, look, you make 200 times more than I do. Can I get an extra $1 or $2 an hour? I think that's a great point.
David MacDonald, senior economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.